Hi, guys. We've got a new mic. Hopefully, this will help with the sound. We've had some people saying they struggled. So, we'll see if it works. I have no idea. Um, all right, let's jump in to chapter 4. I'm so excited, guys. I think our next meeting in person is next Monday, May 20th. Is that next Monday? That's I hope I'm remembering that correctly. Um, we are going to jump in. Whitney will be back with us next week. She had a lot going on. Um, so it's just me and you, just us. Um, but that's okay. We're going to start. I do want to make a disclaimer. I had to make photocopies of my Bible because I shipped it off to be rebound. Is that the right word? It's going to have a new binding. If you saw it at the last Bible study, you know I had to super glue the spine back on. So I shipped it off on Monday. But I made photocopies of the book of Nehemiah because it has all my notes in it. So I've got it's actually my Bible from like college, so like from 10 years ago, that I'll use a little bit, but I've also got my notes here. So we've got a lot of shuffling today. Let's jump right in. The book of Nehemiah in our study book is divided up into two sections, and we're going to start with chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. So if you've not read that, go take a read, and we're going to jump right in. I'm going to be back and forth between my Bible, my notes, and our book. So in the beginning of this chapter, we know that Nehemiah and the people have started they've started rebuilding the wall, and they're facing some opposition because there are some people who aren't very happy with them. And we see that Sanballat, I think that's how you say that, and Tobiah, is he in here? Yeah, Tobiah's in. He comes up. And you'll want to remember him. He actually makes an appearance again at the end of the book of Nehemiah. So keep in mind that Tobiah is part of the group of the enemy. He is someone who does not want Nehemiah and these people to be doing what they're doing. So anyway, these people mocked the Jews. And then they asked them some questions that were pretty demeaning. What are these pathetic Jews doing? Can they restore it by themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they ever finish? Can they bring these burnt stones back to life from the mounds of rubble? And then, whoops, I'm also on baby duty, so I'm making sure Evie's good. So, what did Nehemiah do when he started to face this opposition? I'll give you 2 seconds to write it in the comments because I bet you already know the answer. He prayed. Imagine that, a man whose life was defined by prayer, his first defense in this situation where he was being faced by these people that despised and mocked him, his first reaction was to pray. So we're going to talk a little bit about this prayer. It is in verse 4, so chapter 4, verse 4. It says, "Listen, our God, for we are despised. Make their insults return on their own heads." Sorry, I have notes right now. I have it marked here. Told you it'd be funny today. Listen, our God, for we are despised. Make their insults return on their own heads, and let them be taken as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their guilt or let their sin be erased from your sight, because they have provoked the builders. So we're going to talk a little bit about that prayer, and yeah. So first of all, the reason that these men were opposed to what Nehemiah and the people were doing is because the rebuilding of this wall would also be the reinstatement of God's law. So right now, these people are thriving off of, they're taking advantage of the poor people and vulnerable people. They're exploiting those needs. But if God's law were to be reenacted, all of that would be taken away because these people would have the freedom to worship. They would have protection from these people, and they would all return to the Lord after a long exile. That's what this says. So it's not that they were just opposed to Israel as a nation, but they were opposed to losing the opportunity to live at the expense of other people. Um, so by bringing God's law back in, they were losing that opportunity to just be nasty humans that took advantage of the poor and took advantage of people that were in low places. So that's why they were so opposed, and this really angered Nehemiah, and he decided not to stop working, but to pray. So his first instinct is to go to God in prayer. And when opposition came, he went straight to the Lord. And it can be tempting to, when opposition arises, it can be very tempting to try and figure it out on our own, face those demons on our own, and try to come up with solutions to get around them, or to give in to them if they're discouraging us or distracting us, or telling us that what we're doing isn't right. Um, it's very easy to give in to that, but it wouldn't be quite so easy to give in if we had that initial response of going to the Lord. So we're going to talk about this prayer. There are some things in here that were very interesting when we read the prayer. I don't know if you guys caught note, but this prayer sounds a little bit different than some of the other prayers Nehemiah has said. He says, "Listen, our God, for we are despised. Make their insults return on their own heads, and let them be taken as plunder to the land of captivity. Do not cover their guilt or let their sin be erased from your sight." Um, so it almost kind of sounds like a prayer of maybe spitefulness and revenge. But we have to keep in mind, Nehemiah was very angry. He was distraught that someone would try to distract him from God's work. Now, he wasn't so distraught that he stepped away. He didn't step away from the work. He just prayed and kept building. So, this prayer somewhat sounds like a prayer of revenge, but in all actuality, it's actually a prayer for justice. He was not praying to get back at them for what they had done, but for God to be faithful. He was praying for his own, not for his own glory, but for the glory of the name of God. Because what Nehemiah was doing, he knew was of God. It was the plan for God. And by being distracted and being discouraged by the enemy, that would not be to the glory of God. What would be to the glory of God is facing that opposition with prayer and continuing to do the work that the Lord has put on your heart. Nehemiah knew that these men were degrading God's chosen people, and they were insulting the nature and character of God as well. So by degrading the Israelites and the people rebuilding this wall, they were also degrading the Lord. So Nehemiah is praying a prayer that the Lord sees their mockery and sees the way they are opposing God's plan, and that he served justice to those people. So Nehemiah placed the situation in God's hands, and then he got back to work. There are a lot of notes here. I don't know that you can see that, but I was going through a really tough season when we got to this chapter of trying to discern God's plan. Because I thought I knew what God's plan was, and I got kind of thrown a curveball, and I couldn't decide if that curveball was a part of God's plan or if it was the enemy, and if that was the enemy trying to distract me or discourage me. And it's so funny because I'm not kidding. That situation in my life happened, and this was the devotion the next day. I'm going to read this word for word. Nehemiah placed the situation in God's almighty hands, and then he got back to work. Immediately following the prayer of Nehemiah are the words, "So they built the wall." Nehemiah and the people did not allow the opposition and distraction to keep them from doing what God had called them to do. We have a very real enemy as well. Our enemy is seeking to distract us and destroy us. He does not want us to finish the work that we've been called to do. He wants us to get apathetic and discouraged. He wants us to give up. Living the life of faith is not always easy, and opposition is sure, but we have a God who is our refuge no matter what schemes the enemy employs. When the enemy attacks, we can follow the example of Nehemiah. We can go to God in prayer and keep working right where God has called us to be. I think that is so powerful, and I think we can talk a little bit about this in Bible study, but there was someone who had posted a question in the Facebook group that I thought, it was a few weeks ago, and I just thought it related a lot to what I had been going through. if I can find it really quickly. Okay, one of the questions was, how do I know when God is presenting an opportunity to me for me to take charge of, and how do I know when to sit back and take a breather? And I think this is kind of, this isn't going to give you the answer to that question, but it's definitely going to hopefully give you some insightfulness. Sometimes God puts things in our life because they're a part of his plan. God reveals things to us, opens doors, and makes things known to us because they're a part of the path that he wants us to take. Unfortunately, Satan also knows us. And while Satan is not all-knowing, he knows our nature. He knows what we care about. He knows our weaknesses. And sometimes when we're presented with opportunities, it can become really hard to tell who is presenting that opportunity. Is it of God or is it of Satan? And I think we have to take a step back and kind of look at where our life is right now. Is this new opportunity? Is it something that's going to take you away from what God is already doing? Is this new opportunity going to deepen your relationship with God, give you more opportunities to get to know him and spend time with him? Is it going to serve him and his kingdom? If the answer to those questions is yes, it may be of God. Some questions to also ask are, is this going to pull me away from what God already has me doing? Or is this new venture causing me a lot of stress and anxiety and confusion? And am I unsure of too many things to know what to do next? If that's the case, I want to encourage you to dig a little deeper and consider that this opportunity could be of Satan. And I wasn't going to share this, but I think I should. It's not super personal anymore, and we're kind of far removed, but the situation I was referring to a little bit ago was actually an opportunity for Zach and I to move forward with an adoption of a woman who is still pregnant with a little baby, and she's not from here. This came at we are not and we're not looking to adopt. This was, again, just a couple of months ago, so Evie was barely 18 months old or so. And we very, very, is this still recording? Hello? Okay, that's so awkward. I'm so sorry. I'm going to turn it up just a little bit. Hopefully that will help. So anyway, sorry. So we got approached. We were not looking, we were not in a position to adopt or have children. And we were approached, and Zach and I were and still are very deep in the midst of growing our personal relationships with God and really pouring into Lifeway here. And we were on fire for God. And then this opportunity smacked us in the face. And I felt ill because I felt like this opportunity to be a part of this story for this baby was taking me out of what God was already doing. And so we prayed about it for quite a few days. We learned more about the situation. And even though we saw a situation where a birth mother and her child were in need of a family for this child to go to, we also saw how this didn't fit in where God had us right now. And that can be hard to understand, which is why I wasn't planning to share it. But I think we all go through times where there are things that just aren't for us right now. And it doesn't mean that it won't be for us later, but it also doesn't mean that it's ever going to be for us. And that's okay. And I think that in that situation, once we knew, after about 10 days, we knew that we weren't the only option and that child had more options that were safe and Christ-loving homes. Zach and I spoke, and we spoke to the person that approached us, and we just told them we feel like this is taking us out of where we're supposed to be doing. This is taking us away from the wall we're building. And even though the enemy in our opinion disguised this as a beautiful thing, it still wasn't for us. And that's what's so crazy about Satan is he has the ability to make the distractions and the ways that he's destroying us and discouraging us, he has a way of making them look like good things. Adoption is a beautiful thing, but stepping into that journey at this time wasn't where God had us. But Satan knew my heart, and he knew that it would take everything in me to recognize that and to say no. And it was the day that we told that person what was going on, they said, absolutely, we understand. And it felt like such a weight had been lifted because it almost felt like God was saying, well done. And we got back to building our wall. And we know that that situation is taken care of. God is providing for that family. But that distraction took us out of where God had us. And if we had said yes, it would have been beautiful. God would have used it for good. But there are a lot of things that would have taken us out of too that God would not, we would have to, that door would be shut. Other doors would be closed because we walked through a door that wasn't meant for us. And I think I circled the words in here. We have a very real enemy as well. Our enemy is seeking to distract us and destroy us. He does not want us to finish the work that we've been called to do. And that is so powerful that we have an enemy that knows us so well that he knows how to distract us and destroy us. He knows how to make his path look enticing. He knows my heart is for adoption. I mean, the devil knows that I care deeply about adoption. So when I'm on fire for God and I'm walking this path that God has me on, what can the devil use to pull me away? Of course he's going to use this. Why wouldn't he? And I think you guys, as you dig into scripture and you deepen your relationship with God, you'll face things like that more and more. Because when we are getting closer to Christ, the enemy wants to pull us further away. And that's scary, but it's also hopeful because the harder the enemy is working on us must mean that he's afraid because we're clinging to the person we're supposed to be clinging to, and he doesn't want that. So let's keep reading. We're going to move to verses. We've got some questions we can talk on really quick. So write down the 5 attacking questions of Sanballat and the accusations of Tobiah. What accusations does the enemy use in your life? So you can find those accusations at the beginning of chapter 4. I won't read them, but they're literally all right there within the first 2 and 3 verses. And then some of the accusations that the enemy uses in my life, I wrote down, is she following God's plan or following her own? God might want you to do this instead of what you're doing right now. And then I also wrote down, but aren't you trained to do this? Because like we talked about before, God did not use trained, experienced construction workers and carpenters to rebuild this wall. He used ordinary people. And sometimes I feel it's kind of like imposter syndrome of, I'm trained and educated to do this. So why do I think I can do something else? Well, I think I can do something else because I have the power of Christ in me. But that is something I struggle with, is that imposter syndrome. That's definitely an accusation the enemy uses in my life. And then how are you prone to react against opposition? What should be your response? We all know what our response should be. It should be prayer. And we've talked about how if we don't make that a daily habit in our life, it most likely won't be our first response. We're lucky if it will be our last defense. So what are some things we can do to incorporate prayer more often in our life? Okay. Our enemy is seeking to distract us and destroy us. How does he seek to do this, and how can we stand against him? Read Ephesians 6:10 through 20 for a few ways to stand against our enemy. I wrote down some interesting things here. I put, he will use anything. We just talked about that, but he will use anything. If he thinks that it will pull us away from where God intends us to be, then he will use it. Our God is our only chance in winning the battle. Our strength is found in him, and it doesn't exist apart from him. And then that Ephesians, we won't read all of it, but if you'll go read that, it is about the armor of God. The first couple of verses, Ephesians 6:10 says, "Finally, be strengthened by the Lord and by his vast strength. Put on the full armor of God so that you can stand against the tactics of the devil. For our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the world of powers of this darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavens. This is why you must take up the full armor of God so that you may be able to resist the evil day, and having prepared everything to take your stand." And then it goes through the parts of the full armor of God. And I think take some time and dissect that a little bit and look at where you can put on the armor of God in your life. We're going to move on to Nehemiah 4:7-23. And this is, let me pull up. Of course, I closed my Bible. Here it is. Sorry, I just sniffled into the microphone. I'm not used to having a mic this close. Okay. So, beginning in verse 7, we see that when the enemies heard that the work was continuing, they were enraged. We see multiple nations plotting against God's people and the work that God had called them to do. And we should not be surprised. Again, Nehemiah's first resort is prayer. And the one note that I put in here is it says Nehemiah was a valiant leader who led people to God. Nehemiah was a leader that pointed to the greatest leader. And we see that because at one point, it's not just Nehemiah that is praying, but all the people. And they're doing that because their leaders showed them what their first defense should be. And I think that's a really cool thing. It's in verse 9. "So we prayed to our God and stationed a guard because of them day and night." Instead of it saying, "So I prayed," or "Nehemiah prayed," it's "so we prayed." So the entire nation of those Israelites was praying because their leaders showed them what their response to opposition should be. In verse 9, which is what we just read, this is kind of a turning point. And it's, we see that it's not just prayer. They didn't just pray and then expect God to move, and they didn't try to figure it out on their own either. One did not negate the other. We should never think that we're able to do it on our own and we don't need the Lord's help. But we should also never use prayer as an excuse for neglecting the task before us. So these people didn't see the opposition and then pray and wait on God. But they also didn't see the opposition and then try to figure it out on their own without using God's strength. They used both. They prayed to God and they kept working. Prayer emboldens our action. Prayer fuels our faith. Prayer suffocates our fear. It's in prayer that we're reminded that though we don't have the answers, we serve the one that does. Let's see. We're going to read, is it 14? Here it is. Nehemiah encourages the people in this. "After I made an inspection, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, 'Don't be afraid of them. Remember the great and awe-inspiring Lord, and fight for your countrymen, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes.'" So do not be afraid, but instead remember the Lord. Think on who he is. Meditate on his character. Remember that he is working even when we don't understand. And I think that this kind of brings us to where the people have to decide, are they going to fear this opposition that they're continuing to face, or are they going to fight it? And Nehemiah saying, "Do not be afraid," it kind of is the start of them stepping into the boldness of continuing to work, but also being on guard and being ready to go to battle. The book says they were ready to fight, but they would not let anything distract them from finishing the work. I think that's the key. In this second part of Nehemiah 4, we don't see them focusing solely on just praying with no action, and we also don't see them having action without prayer. But we also don't see any of that taking away from the work that they're doing. So while these people are praying and while they are ready to fight, they are continuing to work. One way the enemy might distract us is, sure, he may give us this opportunity, but the distraction might not be us taking the opportunity. It might be the spiritual warfare within of not knowing what to do. Of, do I do this? Do I not? That was for me when we had this experience with this adoption. Um, it wasn't even stepping into that adoption opportunity that was the distraction. It was the warfare inside of my head of, is this for me? Is this not of me? Having the fear and the anxiety. That that alone was Satan winning, because it was pulling me away from God and putting me in a position of trying to figure this out on my own. When in all actuality, I should have been praying, ready to fight, but continuing the work that God had started. So this also says that um, they knew that they may have to enter a battle, but that God would fight for them, and they knew that the cause they were fighting for was worth any battle that may come to them. Let me read Psalm 27. It's Psalm chapter 20, verse 7. It says, "So take pride in chariots and others in horses. Some take pride in chariots and others in horses, but we take pride in the name of Yahweh our God." One thing in here that we'll kind of see is they're continuing to fight despite all this opposition. And it's not because they have like incredible tools and all of this armor and all of these weapons. They're not doing it because they can. They're not priding themselves in their ability to win this battle. They're priding themselves in the work that God is doing in them and the work that they're doing for God. I think it's so cool that the enemies of God saw a bunch of discouraged former exiles, but God saw his mighty warriors ready to step into battle. So the enemies might trust their horses and their weapons, but God's people trust the name of the Lord. And I think that is what set these people apart, is the enemy was relying on Satan. The enemy was relying on their weapons and their ability to overtake and to overthrow and to discourage and to mock. But the people, they found their strength in the Lord, and they weren't doing this task because they wanted to look good or because they wanted to defeat these people or because they thought they were better than everybody else. They were doing this task solely because it's the task the Lord had given them, and that was their strength. That's where they drew their strength from. So the question is simple for us. Will you trust the Lord? Will you not allow yourself to be paralyzed by your fear and instead trust that God will fight for you and do the work that he's called you to do? Let's talk about some of these questions. What is the relationship between prayer and action? How do they work together? And which are you more tempted to depend on? We talked a little bit about that. One thing it said in here was prayer emboldens action. And I think that is so huge because as Christians, we can take action for God and we can pray to God, but there's probably nothing quite as powerful as a Christian who is praying and taking action. Knowing that you're taking action with the strength of the Lord is huge. And that's what these people in the book of Nehemiah were clinging to. We have seen how this passage is a reminder for us to trust the Lord in all things. What is something you need to trust God in right now? Going back through all of this and reading my responses to these questions during a time that was so difficult is really interesting. I look back, I date these pages, and February 26th of this year is when I did these 2 devotions. And it's just incredible to me how literally the day after this turmoil in me started, this fear and this anxiety and this, distraction that was absolutely eating away at my soul. It's amazing that the next day God gave me something that I would cling to. And um, it's crazy how the Lord works. I think, we all have things like that in our life. And sometimes I'll say stuff like, it's so weird that it's not weird. Of course God would use it. Of course God can and does use his power to make an impactful appearance in our life. I want to make sure there's nothing on here that I wanted to read. This is my photocopy of the Bible. One thing I was clinging to during that time was a quote from the book, but I wrote it in my Bible. And it says, we can go to God in prayer and go right back to the work that he had called us to be doing. And that's what I kind of had to do. There's also a verse in here, Nehemiah 4:8. It says, they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw it into confusion. And that almost makes me want to cry, because that was where I was at. I was so confused as to why God had me doing all of this stuff and then would open this door to adoption, that if I was to walk through that door, all of this other stuff he had me doing would just go away. I couldn't do both. And I was so confused. And that's just incredible that I circled it in here, and now I'm going back and reading. They all plotted together. And by they all, it's talking about the enemies, Sanballat, Tobiah, and all the Arabs. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw it into confusion. If that's not evidence enough that confusion is not of God but of Satan, I don't know what is. I mean, we've used that in our family my whole life, but for it to be like right there is crazy. The only other thing I wrote down was in verse 16, I believe. No, verse 17, it says, the laborers who carried the loads worked with one hand and held a weapon in the other. Working in the midst of fear, but knowing that our God is bigger. That's what these people were doing. So I hope this was encouraging to you. I didn't plan to share that story, but I feel like we're far enough removed that it's okay for me to share that now. And looking back now, it's like no wonder. I don't remember when I purchased this book, but I started it right after the new year. And no wonder God had me start that book when I did. He knew I would need that lesson of discerning when the enemy is trying to distract and destroy us, and his ability to use things that we love to distract and destroy us. So that's all. I hope this was good for you guys. Chapter 4 is a good one. The lessons learned are good ones. We are meeting on May 20th, I believe is the date. I don't have my calendar in front of me, but please leave comments below. I'd love to talk to you guys in the comments, and we will gather our comments and use them to facilitate discussion at our monthly gathering next Monday. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.